I guess that means it's time to start. So, well, good evening. It's good to be with you all this evening. I don't know if you got a handout or not. It was emailed to everybody, but if not, that's okay. All of our material is in Genesis chapter 4. So if you have a Bible, you want to go ahead and open it up, Genesis chapter 4. If you don't, I kind of got it rigged up on the screen over there. There's a 90% chance it's not going to mess up Nolan's PowerPoint. I'm just kidding. It's not going to mess it up. It's good. So we're in Genesis chapter 4, and I'm sure we're all familiar with the story of Cain and Abel. A lot of these stories in the book of Genesis, we were fortunate in last quarter to study in the young adult class. We kind of went through the whole book of Genesis, and it was really helpful to kind of go through. I think a lot of times we maybe think of these stories as children's stories, and maybe don't take them seriously very often. So it was really beneficial to go through the whole book. And so I chose to use one of those lessons this evening to kind of go through. If you're not familiar with the story of Genesis, or maybe you are, but it's been a while since you've read through it, I would like to kind of catch us up on the book of Genesis, where we are once we get to chapter 4. As we know, in the very beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it was perfect. God made it in 7 days, and on the 6th day He made humans, and on the 7th day He rested. But at the very end of God's creation, He says it is very good. And that's something we really need to keep in mind as we go through the book of Genesis, because that's the antithesis of the book. The very beginning, it is perfect. There's nothing wrong with God's creation. Humans and God even dwell together in the Garden of Eden. This is this perfect kind of place where humans and God are able to dwell together. Humans are actually given rule over the creation. They're given it to have dominion over. And so they're sort of like co-rulers with God. You know, of course, they're under God, but God gives them this authority over His creation. And it's really this beautiful thing. But as we know, humans rebel. They decide to define good and evil on their own terms. And doing so, they take that right from God and instead are using their own means to decide what's good and what's bad. And in doing so, they fracture not only their relationship with each other. If you remember in the book of Genesis, they're naked and they are afraid to be seen by each other, afraid to be seen by anybody, and they accuse each other. But not only do they fracture their relationship with each other, they fracture their relationship with God, most importantly. And it's very sad. They end up being kicked out of the garden. And does anybody happen to remember what direction they go when they're kicked out of the garden? It's a very minor detail, but it actually plays out a lot in the book of Genesis. Yeah, that's right. They go east. So they travel east, which is, in the Bible, you'll see this a lot through the Old Testament. This is the way of exile. People go east when they're exiled. It's the same thing that happens in the Babylonian and the Syrian exile. And it's the same thing that we see if you look at the tabernacle, how it's set up in the book of Leviticus and Exodus. It has one entrance, and it's on the east. So if the entrance is on the east, you have to be traveling west, right, to get into it. And so that's the way back to God is west, but the way away from God in the Bible is often east. It's a device that's used to kind of help paint a picture for us. It's a literary device. So we see Adam and Eve move east, and they are outside of the garden. They no longer enjoy the easy labor that they enjoyed in the garden. You know, they tended the garden. What kind of labor was this in the garden? Was it hard, you think? Yeah, it was kind of like a hobby almost. You know, it's this easy labor that you do, and just it's a labor of love almost. But was that what Adam enjoyed when he left the garden? No, by the sweat of his brow he brought forth bread from the ground, it said. And so we see that this is it's a corruption of the good creation. It's been corrupted by humans. And we see that over and over again in Genesis. And so you start to see, starts up here, right? This good creation. And you start to see it kind of trickles in a downward direction. So now we get to Genesis chapter 4. And let's see. Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Okay, so we have a little saying at the beginning of chapter 4. Eve says, I have acquired a man from the Lord. This is what most of our English translations say, and there's nothing wrong with this, but we do lose some things in translation when we translate Hebrew into Latin. Eve almost considers herself a kind of co-creator with God. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea that Eve is taking it upon herself that she's equal with God in some way. But this is the first man that comes from a woman. Why didn't God just get a little pile of dust like he did with Adam and form a man out of it? Or why didn't he put Adam back to sleep and take a rib again? Any ideas? Yeah, he's going to run out of ribs, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah, so there's a certain way creation sustains itself, right? So at the beginning, woman came from man. But from then on and forevermore, men come from women. This kind of is the logic is the necessity of both sexes in creation. There's a necessity there that God puts, he binds on creation. That men and women are sort of dependent on each other for the creation to work. And so this is the first human born of woman. And so it's significant. And Eve gives the credit to God, rightly. She says, I have acquired a man from the Lord. But at the same time, it's the creation that God has set in place to create this man, Cain. So Cain comes from Eve. Abel also comes from Eve. And they're a little different. They have different occupations when they grow up. Their occupations are a shepherd or a herdsman and a farmer. A tender of the ground, it says. And so there's a little bit of a difference between a shepherd and a farmer. They both count on the grace of God. They count on soil health, and they count on the weather in a lot of ways for their living. But the difference is that, there's almost sort of a rivalry that goes back a long time. The Scotch-Irish had this kind of rivalry a long time ago. And the rivalry is kind of that, a farmer almost has to be patient. Of course, there's predators that destroy crops. There's pests that destroy crops. But a farmer has to patiently rely on God to bring forth his crops. A farmer or a rancher or herdsman, shepherd in this case, they also wait patiently. But remember David, when he fought Goliath, he referenced a wolf, a bear, and a lion that he had to defend his flocks from. And so there's almost there's another element to the livestock. And so that rivalry has kind of always been there throughout history. And you can see it in a lot of history within countries. Civil wars, for example, have often been fought between those two kind of groups. And I think the Bible sort of sees that and makes reference to that all the way from here in the beginning. So that it comes a time that they both make a sacrifice. They both offer a sacrifice to God. Now, the sacrifice that they bring are the firstlings. It says, in chapter 4, verse 3, and in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. So that was the offering that Cain brought. Not very much detail. The fruit of the ground. Verse 4, Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat, and the Lord respected Abel and his offering. So we later have reference to this in the Bible, the offering of the firstlings. Does anybody want to maybe explain what that means, sort of, the offering of the firstlings of a flock or of the fruit of the ground? I'm sorry? Yeah, right. So when you have a crop, or when you have, say you're a shepherd, you have your first, call it a batch, I'm not sure what to call it, your batch of ewes that give birth. You have these first fruits of your harvest, whatever you're going to make that year. Well, the temptation is to say, I don't know how the rest of the crop is going to turn out, right? Because, you might have a great harvest at the very beginning. It looks like all this grain is coming up. Looks like it's going to be a bumper crop. But then hail could come, or you could have your crop blighted or eaten by insects or something. Something could happen to the rest of it. So the temptation is, I'm going to hold this first amount back, just in case, right? Just in case we see what happens later. But the offering of the firstlings is not to wait until the very end. The offering of the firstlings is an exercise of trust. So you're trusting in God by saying, I'm going to offer the very first of my crop and trust that God will give me enough to sustain me with what's left. You don't give God what's left over, right? And this is something we say even today when we give on the first day of the week. We say we don't give God what's left over, right? We don't wait till the end of the month and say, well, after I paid all my bills and did everything I wanted to do, I have, $20 left over. I guess I'll put that in the plate, right? That's not the trust. That's not the giving that God expects. And so it doesn't say what Cain's offering was, but it does say that Abel offered the first. And so that's something that we can, maybe not. Go ahead.
Another, along with trust, is being thankful. Because we can't do anything on our own. It's all from God.
Right.
So that's just an upfront thank you at the very start. I got this only from you. If I get any more, I get to ask. But this is because you have blessed me so far.
Yeah.
I think all with trust is that thankfulness.
Yeah.
I didn't build my house.
Yeah.
I didn't build my car. I didn't make the gas. There's a lot of things we have in this world that we don't make ourselves. But with God's blessings, we have them. Our jobs, we have them because God has blessed us with those jobs. The ability to think and to use our hands and to work is still from God. I think the older we get, the more we realize that of how truly blessed we are with how much God has blessed us. I think as a young man, I thought, well, I did that. I worked hard, I made the money, and I paid the bills. But I got to think about it. I didn't invent electricity, so I didn't invent the wire, but I use all of that to make a living. And I truly believe that's how God blesses us, and I need to be so thankful for that. Giving up the first I got before I pay any of the bills, I think that's part of our giving. Our firstlings, our first income is our giving to the Lord. As with cheerfulness that thank you for blessing us. We give this to you. I think we ought to have that in our giving. On the Lord's Day.
Yeah.
The same thought.
Yeah.
The same way of living versus we give what's left over. We see that in New Testament when Jesus old story about the old lady who gave 2 mites, gave more than everyone else?
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody else gave of their excess,
Mm-hmm.
not the first, not the first thing.
Right.
They gave of their excess. Whereas the lady who gave 2 mites, that's all she had.
Mm.
And there's where the trust,
Right.
as you just said, comes in. She trusted in the Lord to take care of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And it shows the emphasis, right? Where you put that first amount, that's the emphasis you put on it, is where it came from. And I think it's something that really is hammered home in an agrarian society or in an occupation like they had. Like, listen, nature is cruel. It's not like, net 30, right? I get paid for what I get. You could have wolves come and eat your sheep. You could have something destroy your crops. And so that trust is kind of heightened, a heightened sense of fear, when you trust and listen, even though it's all I have right now, I trust that this is the right thing to do, that this comes first, So yeah, I agree. I think that's the emphasis that we're supposed to put on giving. We're supposed to put on sacrifice. Any other comments before we move on?
Isn't there something about the fat also being like the good stuff,
Mm.
the best? It's not even just the firstborn or
Mhm.
firstlings, but it was like the choice.
Yeah, I think I think the emphasis that he didn't hold anything back. There might have been a temptation to not only give the firstlings, but he also gave of every part of it. That fat that they might have kept back or, rendered down for their own use. He used the fatness of his crop, of his harvest of sheep. Yeah. So this is actually the same verse in verse 4, but it's a different thought. The second sentence of verse 4. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering. Verse 5. But he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. Okay, so this is a dense little passage, I think. And the next one that follows is as well. So we'll kind of lump it together. So God respected Abel and his offering, but not Cain and his offering. Cain was angry and his countenance fell. Verse 6, so the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry and why is your countenance fallen? I'm sure Cain thought this was a dumb question. Cain thought, what do you mean? Why am I angry and why is my countenance fallen? Cain is angry because God rejected him. He rejected his offering. And he accepted his younger brother's offering and his younger brother's sacrifice. But God goes on. He doesn't finish there. Verse 7, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. Its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Okay, so this passage here is very dense. So we're going to try to walk through it very, very studiously. Why are you angry and why is your countenance fallen? So God then says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? This is like, how many of us have done something really stupid and we had to pay the consequences for it?
Not today.
No, not yet. Well, the night's young. Well, we do stuff and we have to pay the consequences. They call that stupid tax, right? You have to pay an extra tax if you do something stupid. You have to pay for it. Who of us, when we do something like that, who of us wants to hear, hey, that thing you just did? That's your fault. You messed up. Nobody likes to hear that. When we mess up, no one wants to hear, hey, that's your fault. We'd rather blame it on someone else, right? We'd rather put the blame off or say, oh, that's just, how that is. Or I didn't know any better. or so-and-so told me to do it, or whatever. We'd rather put that blame off on somebody, but God says, why are you angry? You have the choice to do well. You have the choice to not do well. And you're only dealing with the consequences of your own actions. You know, I mean, this isn't a completely universal thing. I mean, sometimes bad things happen to people, and it's not their doing, right? You know, that's like when Jesus said, what about the people who the Tower of Siloam fell on? You know, did they do something unrighteous? No, he says. It wasn't because of their unrighteousness. Or if a cripple is born, are their parents guilty of something? That's not the point.
Wasn't it common for people to think that way?
No, not at all.
Throughout the Bible, it talks about, somebody wants to blame somebody.
Yeah.
And God, Jesus, God told us it's a way. It happens. Life is not always fair.
Mm-hmm.
We live in a dangerous world.
Yep.
A tower may fall. We may have a car accident. We may have all of these things. We live in a dangerous world.
Yeah.
And things like this happen. And Jesus had the answer every time.
Yeah. Well, look at the book of Job. I mean, all of his friends wanted to gather around and say, Job, are you sure you didn't do this? Or are you sure that you didn't curse God, or you didn't live unrighteously or something? And Job, he swore up and down, that's not what happened. Nolan?
To interrupt you, the wise man said, Ecclesiastes, I think 9:11, time and chance happen unto all. There are these accidental or unexplained things. Yet you're saying that's not what God's saying to Cain here.
Yeah.
This wasn't an accident, or you're just suffering some circumstances because somebody else did something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, bad things happen to everybody from time to time. And it's not always their fault. But in this situation, we all really need a friend like this. We need somebody who will come and tell us when we're mad, we're blaming the world, we're blaming other people, someone to tell us, listen, this is your doing. Only you can fix this. You're the problem in this equation. And so God does that for Cain. He tells him, if you do well, you will be accepted. And if you do not, he says, sin lies at the door.
God's telling him ahead of time, not in retrospect.
Yeah, exactly. So Cain's in this place. He's in a really bad place. This is a common place for humans to be in. It's a place of resentment and anger. Who is he angry at? He might be angry at himself. More likely, it seems he's angry at his brother Abel. And he's angry at God for making a world where he could fail, where this could happen to him. If I don't know how familiar many of you are with the Columbine shootings, one of the first school shootings that happened in Columbine, Colorado. I read a book on the Columbine shootings not too long ago, and it was a book that was particularly terrible, terribly sad. It was written by one of the mothers of the young men who shot up their school. And they kept journals, and you kind of had some insight into how they felt at the time. The journals weren't made public, but she talks about the resentment and the anger that these two young men were dealing with. This is not uncommon in our world. We see, especially young men, dealing with that resentment and anger at the world, that rejection that the world is constantly pushing at. And God is telling Cain, in this situation, you have the power. And like Nolan said, beforehand, he tells him, you have the power to make the situation better. You have the power to offer a better sacrifice. And, maybe that's what it takes. You thought you could keep something back, but maybe not. Maybe offer a better sacrifice. And in the long run, it will help you. And so, he says, if you do not, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. So I got this on the screen here See, we got a pop-up now. I got this on the screen here, but I wasn't able to get the version I have on this laptop, so I just have to, I guess you'll have to trust me. So I have the translations of a lot of these words, and I found it really interesting doing a study on this, on verse 7. Because verse 7, it says, sin lies at the door. That's what that's what my New King James translation says. Now, the original Old King James Version, if you will, translated 1611. A lot of different words in there than we use today. But in the Old King James, it says sin couches at the door. And that's not a word we use very often at all. If you've used the word couch as in a verb in the last 24 hours, you're probably very abnormal, because I don't think anybody uses that word anymore. And so, when they translated this, a lot of New Testament or Old Testament translations, instead of saying couches, they used a word they thought, it's similar enough, and it basically means the same thing. They said crouches. So a lot of you might have that. If you look at you see crouches at the door. And technically, that is an adequate translation. The problem is, when I hear the word crouches at the door, I think of a big cat, right? Some kind of big cat, like a mountain lion or something that's ready to just tear you to shreds as soon as you open that door. And that's how a lot of people have translated this, to say, look, sin is this big cat that's just wanting to tear you to shreds. And the problem is that word is a Hebrew word, rabas. It is way more closer to the word couch, meaning to lay down. To lie, to stretch oneself out, to lie down, to cause to lie down. And it could be to crouch on all four legs, but folded, like a recumbent animal or a sleepy animal. So to recline, to repose, to lay oneself stretched out. So this is a little bit of a different picture now. Instead of a cat that's all tensed up, waiting to tear you to shreds, you have something that's laying down, stretched out at the door. The next sentence says, and its desire is for you. The word desire is a different Hebrew word that means desire, longing or craving, as a man for a woman, as a woman for a man. So, you have sin is displayed as this creature reclining at the door, or at the tent flap is actually the word. Laying on the other side of the tent. Stretched itself out. It's made itself some kind of seductive creature. And its desire is for you. Well, is sin always something that scares the living daylights out of us? I mean, if you saw a mountain lion when you weren't expecting to see one, that would scare you, right? But is sin always appearing that way? No, lots of times sin is very seductive. Sin offers itself in a way that makes it look good. It makes it look like it would be enjoyable, like it wouldn't be harmful in any way. And so, when God tells Cain, if you do not do well, it says sin is waiting for you. And it looks good. It's seductive. It wants you to enjoy it. But you should rule over it. You should rule over the desire. This isn't some crazy wild animal that you're supposed to rule over. This is a desire you're supposed to rule over. And then, so we come to that word in verse 7, you should rule over it. You might have a different translation that says instead, you must. Thank you. I drew a blank there. You must rule over it. So those words both kind of mean the same thing in this context. We understand what they mean. If you are a John Steinbeck fan, you may have read East of Eden. It's an excellent book. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it. It's a fictional story. But in it, there's like this whole chapter devoted to this one word when this story is told. And it's about how, he tells a story about how he sat with all these Hebrew scholars and they studied the word for years and years. And finally, they arrived at the translation, "Thou mayest." And the difference is, you might think, oh, that seems similar to must and should. But mayest has a different ring to it. You may rule over it. It means it's up to you. It's the tree in the garden. You may eat of it. But there will be consequences if you do. You may have thought before, why did God put the tree in the garden? Why didn't He put it far, far away? Because we were given a choice. Even from the very beginning, we're given a choice. God presents Cain with this choice here. Sin lies at the door. And it looks seductive. It looks good. But you have a choice to rule over it. You could be like Abel, your brother. You could offer an adequate sacrifice. And you could rule over sin. And then we have all this hope for Cain, but verse 8 is crushed. He kills his brother. It says, and he talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. So he didn't take the words of God to heart. It appears that he found himself stuck in this resentment and this brooding that he was in, and he let sin rule over him. This seems like a failure in this small story, and it is. There's in this microcosm, it is a small failure. But as we go on, you'll see that the story is leading somewhere. So Cain kills his brother. God says, "What have you done?" "Where is Abel your brother? I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" God said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now, you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth." So Cain is punished in that, remember that curse from the ground that Adam got? Well, Cain's is worse. Now the ground is even more cursed for Cain. It will no longer bear fruit for him. And now he's cursed. He has to wander the earth, leave, basically another exile. And as you might have guessed, we see the part where Cain, he says his punishment is greater than he can bear. "You have driven me from this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth." And he's worried that people will kill him when they see him. And the Lord puts a mark on Cain. He says, "Whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And then it says, verse 16, "Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden." So farther away from Eden now, he goes east. He dwells in the land of Nod. So once again, we see this exile of humanity. So when we see this, it kind of should start to register in your mind what's happening here. So you saw at the very beginning, you had this perfect Eden where everybody was at peace with each other and they lived with God. Creation was good, very good. And then humanity fractures. Humanity fractures that relationship. And they're moving east. And then Cain kills his brother, and they move east. And then we see all of these bad things happen, and it leads up to the flood, and then it leads to the Tower of Babel. And finally, the first 12 chapters of Genesis are horrendous. I mean, it's this just spiraling, constantly spiraling away from God and away from righteousness. And in the very first couple of chapters, you hear about this prophecy. There's this prophecy that the woman's seed will crush the head of the snake. And that prophecy, I want to imagine you're reading the Bible for the very first time. That prophecy is going to stick with you. Like, okay, well, it wasn't Cain, and it wasn't Abel because he's dead. And then they had another son, and they have more descendants, but no one really seems to be stepping up to the plate to crush sin, to crush the head of the snake. And sin just gets worse and worse. And then God chooses, chapter 12, Abraham. And the story takes a turn now. No longer are we talking about the whole world. God has focused in. Now we're just talking about Abraham and Sarah. And so this is the beginning of God's rescue mission. God is going to rescue the good creation from the hands of corruption, the hands of sin. God is going to rescue the good creation, and this plays out all throughout the Old Testament. And this is why we have to understand and read the Old Testament. The Hebrew Scriptures are so important for us to understand the story of Christ. Because all along from the story of Adam and Eve, all the way through Abraham and his family, to the kings, the prophets, and all of the things that happen, they point towards one figure in the Bible. That's Christ. The Old Testament points forwards. It points towards the problem of sin. And who's going to fix that problem? Who's going to rescue creation from the hands of sin? Christ. And so that's what the book of Genesis is really leading us up to. And that's what we see here, the Cain and Abel story, is how bad sin really has gotten on earth. And killings are something that happen every day in our culture. And it's awful to see that sin. But the church is part of that good creation and part of rescuing the world out of it. So that's all I had. We have a couple minutes left. If you have any questions or comments, anything anyone would like to say?
I wondered about sin lying at the door. It almost sounds like, I didn't even think about it as far as a desire as much as a hindrance, a trip.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's down lower and that recumbent.
Mm.
If you're not aware of yourself or paying attention, that's when you hear about people who get cut off at the knees. That was what I thought of when the term lying at the door.
Yeah.
I didn't even think about design at all, just
Hmm.
being tripped up. I remember my grandmother working in the kitchen and Boots the cat always at her feet. And she was always aware that cat is going to trip me and she would kick him out of work.
Yeah.
So I thought about the cat lying down there.
All right. Interesting. Nolan, do you have something?
Just a very minute thing, beginning of verse 3, in the process of time it came to pass, right? So if you're just reading Genesis 1, 2, 3, it's like the son was born, the son was born, and all of a sudden this story, there's been this there's however many number of years, but we think about living a life of experiences and what you've learned, and obviously by reference they had some introduction to the Word of God as law of how this is to be done. But they've had experiences built up from their youth to however old they are at this point. And the Bible often does that. Hundreds of years may be covered between a chapter and a verse or something. So there's a section of time there we kind of got to have in the back of our mind for them to get from birth up to grown men working, all the things you talked about.
Yeah, and to that point, I find it hard to imagine. I find it hard to imagine that this was the first out of the blue sacrifice that God ever required. This seems to be something that, like you said, they may have grown up with or had experience with, and should have known how to produce this. So yeah, good point. All right, thank you. Appreciate it.